Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 79 for Monday, the 7th of September 2020, and this is our second outing on the supplementary series Thoughts and Themes. Today's episode I've kind of unofficially called Race Through Time, which is me trying to be clever, and we're going to look at the underlying themes of race portrayed in cinema, tying that into the recent Black Lives Matter global movement. My name is Martin Darlington, and today I'm flying solo, but Andrew will be back very soon, although our next outing probably will be with a guest host, more of which later. Today's topic is both topical and delicate, as we'll examine the thread running through Glory, which we covered in episode 19, the story of a black regiment in the US Civil War, to Selma, set 100 years later, which was episode 17, detailing civil rights marches led by Martin Luther King Jr., and we'll also be making significant nods to Mississippi Burning, which we covered in episode 59, The Ones That Got Away Part 2, and Hidden Figures, which was episode 10 and remains one of our favourite movies. We'll soon be covering Just Mercy, which I recently watched, and I was tempted to postpone this TNT episode until after that movie, but we also want to cover Harriet, the biopic about Harriet Tubman, who ran an underground railway around the time of the United States Civil War, getting escaped slaves safely to the north. We also want to look at Black Klansman, 12 Years a Slave. And there's a risk we never actually get round to doing this episode, but I will be making some reference to Just Mercy's main protagonist, Brian Stevenson, and the incredible work done by his Equal Justice Initiative. I also want to say that I'm very aware there are equally valid situations of ongoing injustice and prejudice against Native Americans, the Hispanic population and other groups, and it's not just in the US, of course. This happens in the UK and many other countries, but primarily the focus of today's episode will be the US and the treatment of its African American community. Before we get into the main body of the show, a little bit of housekeeping. We have had a huge number of emails, and to spare the ears and precious time of all of you, I'm not going to go through them all here, but I do have to say a massive thank you to all the lovely people who sent me messages of condolence. For anyone who's wondering why I needed them, in early August, one of my best friends, who also happened to be my mother-in-law, died. Not unexpected. She's had an operation 2.5 years ago. She's been paralysed from the chest down, and she was slowly deteriorating. But I've been home for the funeral, which went as beautifully as such events can, but hence our rather disrupted summer schedule. Sue was a great friend to me, but she was also great friends with my own mum, who died 6 years ago. And she shared my mum's philosophy on the whole life thing, being that there's no life without death and there's no death without life. Given the choice, which of course we're not, she'd rather have both than neither, and I very much subscribe to that view. I hope I've managed to reply to all the recent emails, those offering messages of support and condolence, and also the podcast-related ones, but if I have missed any, please do send a reminder to hosts@historybyhollywood.com and I'll get back to you soonest. As our inbox becomes busier, I'm not sure it's fair to everyone else to read out each message, but I do want to continue to acknowledge the senders, as I know myself it takes some effort and commitment to sit down and write to a stranger, and we really do appreciate those efforts. Hi, this is Martin, jumping out of post-production, editing, and just adding this to say, for those who would rather we dealt with our main remit, which is looking at films and examining the truth behind them, we will be returning to that, and even future thoughts and themes will be very much more cinematically focused rather than on political and cultural commentary, which this episode is. If you find you don't like it, I quite understand. It is just basically me spouting my opinions. But please do bear with us because we will be returning to the normal output very soon. Well, with the next episode. And without further ado, here's back to the intro. I do also have to pay a great tribute to Mark Dupre, not only our resident professor of all things cinematic, just as Dr. Phil Pomerantz is our medical consultant, but Mark is also the arranger and performer of the piano version of Jules Chisek's Waltz of Anachronism, our main theme. And Mark both produced it in piano form and recorded it, and that's the theme music for this and future Thoughts and Themes episodes. And of course you heard it earlier in the opening minute of this show. If anyone remembers when we covered First Man, the story of Neil Armstrong and the first moon landing, we mentioned that he was a fan of the theremin. This is an electronic instrument that produces a very distinctive and quite haunting sound, and was used in the Doctor Who theme music for those who are familiar with the very long-running British sci-fi series. Now, when we did First Man, I'd never heard of a theremin, and I had to rely on Andrew to educate me, but several listeners had, and I think it was either during that episode or possibly the introduction to the following one, that we mused how rather special it would be if we could find someone who could produce a version of Jules' theme on a theremin. Up stepped Professor Dupre, who got in touch with the New York Theremin Society, who can be found at www.nythereminsociety.org. That's NY, and then theremin is spelled like there, over there, THERE, min, abbreviation for minimum. Sorry, that's a very long-winded way about telling you how to spell something. So it's nythereminsociety.org. And we're delighted to be able to thank Dorrit Chrysler of the Society, who has arranged, performed and recorded a theremin version for us. Dorrit also informed me the theremin is 100 years old this year, which is incredible, and there's a Theremin 100 record released by her group featuring 3.5 hours of theremin music, featuring 50 thereminists from 18 different countries. A link to Bandcamp and this record, along with a link to the Society's website, will be in this week's show notes. And with that, let's wrap up the intro, and what better way to lead us into the main part of today's show but Dorrit Chrysler and her theremin with a incredibly haunting version of the Waltz of Anachronism, the theme of History by Hollywood. So today I want to look at racism. Not every aspect of it, and I'm not going to pretend I have any answers or solutions, but I do have plenty of opinions and ideas. I'm very aware this is a fairly universal problem across the globe and all cultures. It's far from limited to black and white antagonism, but due to our remit, the main producer of the movies we've examined, and the genesis of the recent Black Lives Matter protests being the United States, that's where we'll mainly focus. Having said that, I'm immediately going to take you back when I was in the British Army, based in Germany in the 1980s. I was once asked by my German girlfriend at the time why sometimes the British soldiers behaved well, quite courteous and just out to have fun, yet on other occasions behaved like football hooligans and just seemed to be out to try and generate as many fights as possible and to alienate the local German lads. I had to think about it. Often, she pointed out, these could be the same guys, week on week, behaving in very different ways. The conclusion I came to is about 10 to 15% of the army were strong characters and good guys, decent, respectful, and okay, nearly all soldiers are going to tend more towards the aggressive side of behaviour than most people in society, than the average. That's why they've joined the army. But they generally behave decently unless they were attacked or threatened. However, there's another 10 to 15% of strong characters who are nasty, violent and quite willing to behave in a criminal way. The remaining 70 to 80% are sheep, and they will follow whichever dominant characters from one of the first two groups happens to be amongst them and being dominant that evening. As all armies draw their soldiers from their civilian societies, I don't see any reason why society as a whole isn't the same. We're a herd animal, or a tribal one if you prefer. So that's the first basis of my thoughts. We also need to remember that there's an inertia to public opinion. And that can be as hard to get moving when it's static as it is to divert its course once it's moving in a given direction. So taking the initiative, being consistent and persistent is incredibly important. Before I go further, I also have to acknowledge that as a white, middle-aged, middle-class male with no particular distinguishing features, I have never, ever experienced the kind of systematic discrimination that other people have to endure day on day, week on week, year on year. Any of you listening to this who are white, educated and able-bodied are almost certainly going to have to acknowledge the same. The exception, of course, is Jewish people, from which community I know we have some listeners. And that brings me to my next point. Nazi Germany made Jewish citizens wear a yellow star. In Northern Ireland, where near universal discrimination against the Catholic community was practiced for decades after partition, the independence of the Southern Republic of Ireland, and during this a prospective employer in Northern Ireland would ask for the applicant's address and was immediately able to tell from which community the applicant came due to their location of where they lived, their house, and they'd therefore be able to decide if they're going to get a job or not. Why did we do this? Why did we ask for addresses, make people wear yellow stars? Because at first sight there was nothing obvious to make a Jew or a Northern Irish Catholic stand out. But if the thing that makes you different is as obvious as skin colour, there's no need for a badge, no need to ask your address or your religious affiliation or anything else. You can't hide it. And if the observer has any kind of existing prejudice, following the old adage that you only get one chance to make a first impression, you're immediately at a disadvantage. I did say we would primarily focus on the US, and in the interest of brevity, I don't plan to go into a lengthy description of the origins and structure of the slavery system, beyond acknowledging that the Africa to America slavery industry was established by European powers, largely for the areas with which we're concerned, the British. When anti-slavery sentiment grew in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the proponents of the system, mainly drawn from the ranks of those who profited from it either directly or indirectly, found that they couldn't really use the "but it makes us more money" argument and hope to win over public opinion. So the argument was developed that it was the duty of white Christians to Christianize and educate black Africans. This idea was promoted, and this is the birth of the white supremacy movement. Enslaved to save, their campaign slogan might have read. Very mercenary roots, but this then grew. So to the rich, it was a cynical way to attempt to ensure the continuation of this most profitable of labour forces. And to the poor white communities, both in the young United States and the British workers in the West Indies, this gave them the sense that they weren't the bottom of the social strata. There was someone they could always look down upon. Now, the US Civil War has been argued over its causes, the true causes, the underlying motivations for it occurring. They have been and still are argued over. Whatever the causes may have been, one of the results was the abolition of slavery throughout the United States of America. What steps Abraham Lincoln may have taken after the war we'll never know due to his assassination. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, chosen precisely because he was a Southern Democrat who, Lincoln hoped, would make his administration less abhorrent to the South, succeeded to the presidency. And he's a strange character, Andrew Johnson, a bit of a contradiction. He was a passionate unionist, but he also believed in states' rights, and he was a white supremacist. The result of this was that Reconstruction, the process of reassimilating the former Confederate states, was a very watered-down version of what it's possible Lincoln may have envisaged. Now, President Johnson supported the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, but he opposed the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed certain civil rights for all US citizens, which in the aftermath of the 13th Amendment included the African American community. Thankfully, the Republican Party, that of Abraham Lincoln, held veto-proof majorities in both Congress and Senate, so the 14th Amendment was forced through despite the president's opposition. However, as I say, the way it was implemented was rather watered down. It's also worth reminding ourselves that at the time of the Civil War, the Republican Party was the primarily anti-slavery, pro-union, federal and progressive party, and the Democrats were more conservative. Lincoln had been the first Republican president, And as Andrew had to tell me, it was only in the latter half of the 20th century that these roles reversed, as before that the southern states were so wholeheartedly Democrat that they were referred to as Dixiecrats. The reversal process started with John F. Kennedy's progressive policies upsetting many in the South, and we had Goldwater, I think his name was a Republican politician in the 60s and 70s, and then of course in the 80s we had Ronald Reagan's 2 terms as a far more right-wing conservative Republican president. Going back to the Civil War, the costliest war in lives lost that the US has ever fought, we can introduce our first movie reference with a clip from Glory. Now this movie covers the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, an African-American regiment that fought in the Civil War, and it was the subject of HBH episode 19. Now the troops were black but the officers were white, and the CO, Colonel Robert Shaw, played by Matthew Broderick, in this clip he sought out Private Tripp, played by Denzel Washington in an Oscar-winning performance, and he's inviting him to carry the regiment's colours in their next action after he distinguished himself on the battlefield. Tripp seems reluctant, and the colonel is curious to know why, and he invites the private to speak his mind.
I mean, what's the point? Ain't nobody gonna win, it's just gonna go on and on.
Can't go on forever.
Yeah, but ain't nobody gonna win, so.
Somebody's gonna win.
Who? I mean, you get to go on back to Boston, big house and all that. What about us? What do we get?
Well, you won't get anything if we lose.
Well, we can say Colonel Shaw is right about getting nothing if they lose. To put Private Tripp's concerns into context and to give them some validity, even though he was a fictional character, is a very realistic concern. Let's jump straight into our next clip from Selma, and this is one of the opening clips. This is a movie set 100 years after the end of the Civil War, and it was covered in HBH episode 17. And what you're about to hear is the character is Annie Lee Cooper. She was a real lady and wonderfully played by Oprah Winfrey, and she's trying to register to vote.
You work for Mr. Dunn down at the rest home, ain't that right?
Yes, sir.
Wonder what old Dunn will say when I tell him one of his gals down here stirring a fuss.
I ain't stirring no fuss. I'm just here trying to register to vote.
Recite the Constitution's preamble. You know what a preamble is?
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
How many county judges in Alabama?
67.
Name them.
So, Tripp, a fictional character, but as we said, with a very realistic point of view, was completely right. The reluctance of the Union administration to use their victory to force Southern compliance led to a very different interpretation of emancipation in the former slave states. Enormous discretion was applied in how a citizen was assessed as worthy of being given the right to vote. Now, of course, if you weren't a registered voter, you couldn't serve on jury duty. Therefore, pretty much every jury will be manned by white male jurors. This is not a recipe for equality of justice. Our next clip from one of our favourite episodes, HBH episode 10, of course, Hidden Figures. And this sees Katherine Johnson, the NASA mathematician and African-American heroine, being confronted by Al Harrison, her supervisor played by Kevin Costner, over her repeated and prolonged disappearances from their office.
Where the hell have you been? Everywhere I look, you're not where I need you to be. It's not my imagination. Now, where the hell do you go every day?
To the bathroom, sir.
To the bathroom. To the damn bathroom. For 40 minutes a day?
There's no bathroom for me here.
What do you mean there's no bathroom for you here?
There is no bathroom. There are no colored bathrooms in this building or any building outside the West Campus, which is half a mile away. Did you know that? I have to walk to Timbuktu just to relieve myself. And I can't use one of the handy bikes. Picture that, Mr. Harrison. My uniform, skirt below my knees, my heels, and a simple string of pearls. Well, I don't own pearls. Lord knows you don't pay colored enough to afford pearls.
Well, Al Harrison was completely unaware of the bathroom situation, and Katherine Johnson's revelation leads him to take a crowbar and smash the signs that designated bathrooms as either coloured or white. Now, it should be pointed out that Harrison is an amalgam of several bosses Katherine had over the years, but one of them did take similar action over the bathroom situation. And it's strange watching that scene again to get the clip and just to remind myself of this. The room is full of white male. They're almost like robots or replicants. They're all wearing white shirts, slim black ties. They all look like kind of carbon copies of Al Harrison. And there's this wonderfully angry and desperate African-American woman in a dress, and she's, as you heard, she's yelling at, my uniform should include a string of pearls. I don't have any pearls. So, yeah, it's a very revealing scene. The Al Harrison character, like John Glenn's accurate portrayal in that movie, is totally mission-focused. He couldn't care less about a team member's gender, colour, or anything else, only on their ability to contribute. It's sad to say that in Virginia, at the time of the movie set in the 60s, that was far from a universal attitude. So, we've established that equality did not, and many would say does not, exist. Now, it could be argued that no society throughout history has ever practiced true equality across all its citizens. But is that any reason not to strive for such a situation? Think about stories of injustice and how powerful they can be. The fugitive, Dr. Richard Kimball, wrongly accused of a crime, is pursued by US Marshal Sam Gerard, and this was Harrison Ford in the movie, and Tommy Lee Jones as the US Marshal, and it's for a crime he didn't commit, desperately trying to prove his innocence and not knowing where is it safe to turn, because everyone, the authorities, everyone's turned against him. Erin Brockovich, similar kind of thing, fighting against powerful industrial interests, or The Insider, which we cover with Jeffrey Wigan taking on Big Tobacco. And now imagine those movies again, but without the positive outcome, the happy ending, without the final victory. Imagine the desperate knowledge that every element of official apparatus is biased against you simply because of the pigment makeup of your skin. Now that's a concept that's incredibly hard to imagine for a white person, but that is the daily truth for millions of black people. Now our next couple of clips are from a movie we've not yet covered, but I mentioned in the intro. This is Just Mercy, which we're hoping to cover later this year. It's a movie about lawyer Brian Stevenson, African-American, went to Harvard. I won't go into great detail about the man or the movie because it is a forthcoming episode, but I strongly urge anyone to see the movie first if you haven't already. It's based around his autobiography of the same title, Just Mercy, and it covers his attempt to overturn the conviction for murder of Walter McMillan, known to his friends as Johnny D, played by a wonderful Jamie Foxx. Brian Stevenson himself was played by Michael B. Jordan, equally compelling. Rotten Tomatoes critics score it at 84%, but 12,000 audience members average out at 99%, which should give you an idea just how watchable and powerful this movie is. So the next clip is an opening statement in a courtroom made by Brian Stevenson from the movie, but it won't give away any spoilers.
It's easy to see this case as one man trying to prove his innocence. But when you take a black man and you put him on death row a year before his trial, and exclude black people from serving on his jury, when you base your conviction on the coerced testimony of a white felon, and ignore the testimony of 24 law-abiding black witnesses, when any evidence proving his innocence is suppressed and anyone who tries to tell the truth is threatened, this case becomes more than the trial of just a single defendant. It becomes a test of whether we're going to be governed by fear and by anger or by the rule of law.
So that should summarise the obstacles facing anyone seeking justice in not every part of America, but certain parts of America. And this isn't the 1860s or even the 1960s. The events portrayed in this movie happened in the early 1990s. And to follow up on that, here's a clip from an interview with the real Brian Stevenson about the foundation, or his foundation, the Equal Justice Initiative, based out of Montgomery, Alabama, a town which featured heavily in the 1960s civil rights struggles.
Stevenson views America's dark past as directly connected to what he sees as her troubled present.
We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world because we've allowed ourselves to be governed by fear and anger. It was that same politics of fear and anger that allowed us to engage in a native genocide and slavery and lynching and segregation.
He has dedicated his life to fighting for justice, getting 135 people off death row. Critics say the death penalty is biased and flawed. Data suggests that for every 9 people executed, 1 has been exonerated. Stevenson's life work has been memorialized in a new film based on his best-selling memoir, Just Mercy.
We all need grace. We all need mercy.
Now, the statistic quoted by the presenter that for every 9 people executed in the US, 1 is exonerated after initial conviction is a statistic that I find absolutely terrifying and really puts the question of judicial execution front and centre. For certain crimes, in certain circumstances, I used to agree that the death penalty would be appropriate. Then I thought about it and realised that no, I believe this up to but not beyond the point that I'm wrongly convicted of such a crime. So I'm no longer a supporter of capital punishment in any circumstances. I really don't believe that any reasonably intelligent and aware person can argue that there is not a deeply ingrained bias against African Americans in the US. Now, that same bias also exists against black people in the UK and France and most Western countries. What does make a difference between the US and most other countries of which I can speak with any authority of knowledge is the death penalty. A wrongful conviction, of which we have plenty in the UK, being overturned and the former prisoner exonerated, is little comfort if they've already been executed. And race plays a part here too. 42% of death row inmates are African American, yet they represent only 13% of the US population. Now, there's an obvious statistic I've not quoted there, and that's to do with the proportion of crimes committed, but we'll come to that in a bit. So, there is a problem. And it's an ongoing problem, as demonstrated by the recent deaths of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer, or Ahmaud Arbery murdered at the hands of a white father and son because he was jogging through their neighbourhood and they thought he looked like a burglar. And don't forget, this was a murder that was not vigorously investigated until it became the subject of a national media campaign. Or emergency medical technician Breonna Taylor. Sadly, that list could go on and on. Why? Why is there so much hatred and anger and resentment at the very notion of urgently revising attitudes so prevalent amongst some of the white population? Throughout human existence, there has often been a strong resistance to change. For those of us with a few decades under our belts, I'm sure we've all seen those social media posts where friends nostalgically refer to our innocent childhoods when we had no mobile phones, no game consoles, we got up to a good honest mischief, running around playing fields and woods, skinning our knees and getting muddy. I often find myself pondering the purpose of such musings. Is the author suggesting we take a reverse step in technological advancement and get rid of mobile phones and game consoles? Maybe we should get rid of everything. Why stop at mobiles and PlayStations? Let's ditch anything electrical, or anything with an internal combustion engine, if only to hear the earth breathe a sigh of relief. Let's go back to riding horses, ploughing by hand. We'll equip our armies, if we need them, with longbows rather than rifles, and we'll live in mud huts. I was going to say caves, but I don't think there are enough caves to go around. But you see my point, which I will stop making now because I'm dangerously close to going off topic. Rich people's resistance to overseeing true equality of opportunity and justice is pretty obvious. They may be compelled to share. One explanation of the hatred of the working class whites of America, though, the poor whites, has already been mentioned in the comment about the advent of white supremacy. It gave the poorest of whites someone to look down upon. Now, this attitude was depicted or described in the movie Mississippi Burning, when the Gene Hackman character, an FBI agent who grew up in Mississippi, tells his boss, played by Willem Dafoe, who is not a Southerner, about his daddy, who was a dirt poor farmer. Now, you will hear a word bleeped out. That's not through oversensitivity, although it's not a word I would comfortably utter myself, but just to avoid the need to label this episode explicit, but it starts with an N, and I don't think it needs any further explanation.
Where does it come from? All this hatred?
You know, when I was a little boy, there was an old Negro farmer who lived down the road from us named Monroe. And he was, I guess he was just a little luckier than my daddy was. He bought himself a mule. That was a big deal around that town. Now, my daddy hated that mule. Because his friends were always kidding him about, oh, they saw Monroe out plowing with his new mule, and Monroe was going to rent another field now they had a mule. And one morning, that mule just showed up dead. They poisoned the water. And after that, there was never any mention about that mule around my daddy. Just never came up. So one time we were driving down the road and we passed Monroe's place and we saw it was empty. He just packed up and left, I guess, gone up north or something. I looked over at my daddy's face and I knew he'd done it. And he saw that I knew. He was ashamed. He looked at me and he said, if you ain't any better than who are you better than?
So that is one possible explanation for the genesis of this hatred and resentment. It's probably a good point to also look at the nature of racism. Of course, it's not born from a single source. Also, it's not manifested in the same way in different people. There are those who simply hate people of other coloured skin, just as there are those who hate people of other religions, other cultures, musical taste, football team preference, and so on. And that sounds trivial, but I've met people who actually hate fans of other football teams, or particularly a rival football team, even ones they've never met and they don't know. I mean, it really is a basic human trait, it seems, very sadly. Hatred of people of colour, though, is very easy to maintain consistently, again, as we mentioned, because of the obvious nature of the difference. Now, one opinion I did read when researching for this episode was a rather depressing idea that we will never truly rid ourselves of colour-based prejudice until the human race is sufficiently intermingled through mixed-race relationships that we all look similar in hue and facial characteristics. And unfortunately, that is most likely a rather long way down the road. So the hatred can be born out of jealousy, fear, wanting to be part of a clan or tribe or group. I mean, who wants to be the only guy in town who's not a member of the local KKK? You're going to miss out on all the Sunday afternoon barbecues. Okay, I'm being flippant, but the point I'm making is we're back to this thing about 70 to 80% of society are generally sheep. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, I'm not being rude, but we like to conform. There's another type of racist, though, and often people in positions of authority and power who are culturally racist, not in an angry or hate-fueled way. And the example I'm going to use might be controversial to some people, but Winston Churchill, very well known in his early army days, and he continued this trait throughout his life, but even as a junior officer serving in India, he would berate officers, some of senior rank to him, and soldiers who failed to treat Indians in a decent and respectful way. Churchill was certainly not a vicious or a hateful man, but he equally certainly did not view those Indians as his equals. So his is a paternalistic, condescending racism. It's still a form of racism. And the same could be said of Andrew Johnson, the presidential successor to Abraham Lincoln that we talked about earlier. He stated in 1866 that he did not believe former slaves were capable of taking control of their own lives. Well, in the immediate aftermath of emancipation, he was probably right, because up to that point, the slaves had never had to manage their own affairs. But with Johnson and many other American leaders of the era, this was not a belief based around the fact that they've not experienced managing their own lives yet, but far more a belief that the white race was superior and the African Americans were inferior in some way. So it's in the context of hundreds of years of slavery practiced by the European colonial powers, then continued under the emergent nation of the United States, followed by emancipation on paper that changed little about their day-to-day lives right up to today, where we see in this context the statistics on poverty, crime and punishment, and the general lack of opportunities that the Black Lives Matter movement has suddenly found a new and globally spreading momentum. That momentum has to try and move a majority of the population, many of whom just don't really care enough to think about it on their own. And this is again what we were talking about earlier with inertia and initiative. Now, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that a riot is the language of the unheard, and there's definitely something in that. However, his real genius, in my opinion at least, was his recognition of the power of peaceful protest. Think about the scenes in Selma, either the movie or the real events, which you can watch on YouTube, horrible though they are, when he led a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside the town of Selma. Martin Luther King, like Gandhi before him, understood that when you don't fight back, when you take the beating, in this case of the Alabama state troopers, you leave the racists and their apologists nowhere to hide their hatred. You leave them with nothing to defend their actions but their fear, their hatred, their anger, and as we saw in the 1960s, the world turns against them. I was born in that year, so I have no direct memory of it, but the images of Amelia Boynton lying bloody and unconscious on that bridge flashed across the world and stirred people who otherwise might have ignored the whole event, thinking it had nothing to do with them. The real genius of MLK's leadership, though, and why it's so rare, so valuable and so commendable, was his power of personality, his ability to persuade the justifiably furious, angry young men and women who would normally be expected to fight back against this kind of brutality about the need for peaceful protest. I remember the first time I did see those images and I thought to myself, why aren't they fighting back? I wouldn't have taken that crap. And I would have caused a failure. As soon as a riot breaks out, even if it's not being used as cover by the criminally inclined to rob an electronics store, which it normally is, whatever the reason for the riot, it gives those who are trying to perpetuate the bias of the system to claim they're simply protecting the law-abiding citizens of insert name of town or city. In the same vein, I can't help thinking that the Black Lives Matter movement should have been titled Black Lives Matter 2. It's just too much of an open goal for those who oppose the notion of true equality to be able to respond with, no, all lives matter. It's so frustrating. We know that, and I've heard it from white friends who are not inherently racist, but they hear Black Lives Matter as if it's been said to the exclusion of other lives. We know everyone's lives matter. Up to this point, it hasn't felt that black lives mattered as much as white. So that's why I just thought if they'd called it BLMT or BLM2 with the number 2, Black Lives Matter 2, you remove that ability for people to go, no, all lives matter. Sorry, don't know why I keep doing that stupid voice. The argument I hear most, often with a preamble of, look, I'm not a racist and I think everyone deserves an equal chance at life, etc., usually ends with, but you've got to admit, when you look at the statistics, African Americans commit more crimes, take more drugs, end up more in prison, depend on welfare more, etc. I thought long and hard to argue about how vacuous this argument is. I mean, this was like, I remember once, years ago, reading a study that said binge drinkers tend to have a less consistent sleep cycle than people who don't drink. And I thought, you're really putting the cart before the horse there. Binge drinkers, what you mean people who work during the week so they don't drink, and then on a Friday or Saturday night they go out and they're out late. Well, duh. You're looking at a symptom and recognising it as a cause incorrectly. So, I thought long and hard about, I do like an analogy, as many of you will know, and I wanted to illustrate this. And this is not perfect, but I'm going to now give you what I like to think of as ammunition in the good fight, because I'm just assuming that you will all completely share my views on these matters. And this is a counter-argument against the moderate and unconsciously prejudiced people you may know. And I call it the iPhone analogy. So, iPhones come in a range of colours. Let's take 2 examples. We'll call space grey and rose gold. When they come out of the box, they appear identical in all respects other than the colour of their casing. However, Space Grey is bought, immediately put into a very sleek protective case with a top-end screen guard. It's taken home, connected to super-fast broadband Wi-Fi, and the App Store is plundered for its very best and latest apps, irrespective of costs. It's frequently updated as soon as a software update comes up, and there's none of those little red numbers on the front that tell you you've got outstanding updates or messages or emails. Meanwhile, Rose Gold is given no case, no screen guard. The connection is to very intermittent Wi-Fi. The software is very rarely updated. No apps are downloaded from the App Store, even the free ones. There's not even music stored in its memory, other than the free sample music that came preloaded. It's kept in a drawer where keys and loose change and batteries are kept, so its screen becomes chipped and scratched. So when these two phones came out of the box, they were identical other than the colour of the casing. But now, a couple of years down the line, Space Grey looks as good as new. In fact, it's better than new because of all the neat things it can do now that it couldn't do then. Whereas Rose Gold looks tired and battered, and compared to Space Grey, ineffectual. Well, imagine every time you encountered one of these phones, it was the same. All the Space Greys are like really good, all the Rose Golds, they're not. It would be reasonable to assume that if you were writing a review, you'd say, yes, Space Grey's great, Rose Gold's not so great. Well, as far as I can tell genetically, there is so little difference between humans that the tiny difference that do exist only really affect appearance. And okay, possible susceptibility to certain illnesses or medical conditions, but it's about the same proportion of difference than there is between a Space Grey iPhone and a Rose Gold iPhone. The spec and the potential is identical when you take them out of the box. It's what you put into them that creates the difference. That and the environment in which the phone is kept. That's what I believe anyway. Now, let's be realistic. No one is going to change the mind of a deeply hate-based racist, at least not easily. Not until they realise they're standing alone in a sea of tolerance, and most of them being sheep-like, maybe then they'll learn initially just to keep their hatred to themselves, and they may find that it slowly dissolves. The minds we need to change and to energise that this is something they do need to do something about are those of the uninterested, who probably describe themselves more as disinterested, saying, well, it doesn't really affect my daily life. Another protest that's been going on is over the removal of statues, and it does seem that these outcries aren't always very well researched or discerning. There have been some statues of 19th or 18th century figures with demands for removal being used based solely, it appears, on the fact that they were leading figures in societies that were partly financed by slave-using industries. However, imagine being an African American living in Nashville, Tennessee, and having to drive or walk by a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest every day. Forrest was a slave trader and in the Civil War a Confederate general. After the war was lost, he would go on to be the Grand Wizard of the first era Ku Klux Klan. Now, as societies, we erect statues to demonstrate our society's admiration of historical figures or our appreciation of their achievements. In July of this year, the Tennessee Capitol Commission did vote 9-2 in favour of removing Forrest's statue and placing it in a museum, the appropriate place to educate people about historical events and people. This hasn't yet taken place and may not, due to the pandemic, until 2021, but I'm curious to know what the basis of argument was for the two who voted against removing the statue. In the UK, in Bristol, we had a statue removed of a chap, I can't remember his name, but he founded, Clifton, Cornwall, can't remember, but he founded a university, and yet he directly made his money through slave trading and plantations. So I think that's quite appropriate. Now, as it turned out, his statue was toppled into the harbour, which may have proved a hazard of shipping, so they scooped it out. But I saw a very good interview with a historian from Bristol University, happened to be an Afro-Caribbean chap, but he was saying, look, no, let's not destroy it. Let's not start burning books or going down that road, because that's a very dangerous road to travel. He said, no, but let's put them in museums. And he made this that very point. Statues and monuments that are in our public streets reflect our society's admiration and the values to which we would ascribe. Because, of course, that's the first argument of the racist apologist, who will say, oh, you're trying to erase history and you can't do that. No, you're right, you can't. However, to an African-American citizen in Nashville, Tennessee, wouldn't walking past this monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest be just as upsetting as a Jewish German person walking through a German town and seeing a statue of Adolf Hitler? Both men fought and lost wars. They both held vicious racially based beliefs, and they both contributed to a huge loss of life and liberty. What's the difference? Well, there is a difference. There's a really, really obvious difference. There are no public statues of Adolf Hitler anywhere in the world. So I'll wrap up there, having got a lot off my chest. I'm not trying to preach to anyone. Yeah, okay, it does sound like it a bit, but for some reason, as I said earlier, I'm going to assume that the majority of you good folk would largely share my views, and I guess I'm just trying to arm you with some extra ammunition should you come across an ambivalent or undecided friend or acquaintance. It's important to remember, though, that it is the right of anyone to hold pretty much any opinion, and provided they can express it with clarity, they should be allowed to do so. But a final clip I want to play is a reminder from the movie Denial and Professor Deborah Lipstadt on the importance and the nature of freedom of speech.
Some people are saying that the result of this trial will threaten free speech. Now, I don't accept that. I'm not attacking free speech. On the contrary, I've been defending it against someone who wanted to abuse it.
Well, freedom of speech means you can say whatever you want. What you can't do is lie and then expect not to be accountable for it.
Not all opinions are equal. And some things happen, just like we say they do. Slavery happened. The Black Death happened.
The earth is round, the ice caps are melting.
And Elvis is not alive.
Now, we must all guard against the temptation to shut down debate and discussion just because we don't agree with the other side. And that warning applies to debates over racism, gender identity, politics, religion, pretty much any topic you can think of. If we allow discussion to be shut down and stifled, we cannot be upset when a topic we think should be up for debate is shut down because we set such a dangerous precedent. Do you remember the Supreme Court decision in the People versus Larry Flint? The right to offend was deemed to be enshrined in the First Amendment, and it has to be protected. At this stage, I'd usually want to play a clip of the late, great George Carlin, but I'm worried I'll wear out the bleep sound effect, so I won't. Now, the final point I'd like to make, I'm probably going to say this is the final point a few times, is concerning the police, their training, attitudes and behaviour. Now, there have been several calls for police forces in some towns in the US to be disbanded and not replaced with anything. In my opinion, that is so unrealistic and foolish a demand that it actually undermines the real issues. However, for many years, a number of US police forces have undergone so-called warrior training. These are regimes often taught by ex-military instructors. And for me, as a British guy, where we have a primarily unarmed police force, maybe I'm a bit skewed in my view, but they seem far too militaristic and far too aggressive for what I would consider appropriate for a police force. One Alabama police department have got an armoured car complete with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on it. I'm sorry, but when a situation has deteriorated to the point that an armoured car is needed, the police failed long ago. It also needs to be remembered that the vast majority of police officers are not individually racist, violent or overly aggressive. But if they belong to an organisation that is institutionally biased on racial grounds, it's unrealistic to expect that their behaviour won't reflect that attitude. The institutions need to be changed. London's Metropolitan Police Force underwent a period of soul-searching in the wake of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. He was a black teenager studying to become an architect. He was murdered by a gang of white racist thugs who the ensuing police investigation failed to pin down to the point they could charge them. Now, Stephen was murdered in 1993. Now, in 2012, after Stephen's parents launched and maintained a high-profile campaign for nearly a decade, 2 of his murderers were convicted and sentenced to life terms in prison. Now, I'm sure there are black people living in London who will have encountered discrimination at the hands of the police, but there is little doubt that the Met Police are at least trying to alter course on their institutional attitude towards the issue of race. Remember at the start where we talked about inertia? Well, this is the difficulty of changing course. Something in the US needs to change to prevent officers like Derek Chauvin thinking that he can kneel on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes without considering what he may be doing to a fellow human being who, at the stage the kneeling began, appeared to be compliant and clearly in fear and distress. Even if that's too much, Chauvin should at least have some fear of the possible consequences, yet he appeared to think that he was metaphorically bulletproof. In 2018, Amber Guigan, I think it's pronounced, she's a Texas police officer. She drove home, parked her car on the wrong floor of her apartment block car park, and entered what she thought was her own apartment. It wasn't. She'd actually entered the apartment of Botham Jean, an African-American accountant who was sat on his sofa eating ice cream. Shocked to see what she saw as an intruder in her own apartment, Geiger shot him twice, killing him. Surprisingly, Geiger was found guilty of murder and received a 10-year sentence. So despite protests over the lightness of a sentence, what stands out for me is how anyone so obviously inept was ever able to become a police officer in the first place. The lack of judgment, clarity of thought, and her absolutely deadly reaction is so staggering, it makes me wonder who trained her and what form did that training take? Yeah, Botham probably jumped up in shock and protest because the strangers just intruded into his apartment. But I'm baffled as to why her reaction was to pull a gun and shoot him twice. However, the fact that she was arrested, charged and convicted does seem to indicate a sea change, long overdue and only proper though that be. So we're back to the iPhone analogy, where the police view, generally speaking, of African Americans is that they're all rose gold iPhones that don't work as well as space grey ones. That perception needs to change, and it's going to be a hell of a job to do it. I don't want to trivialise the issue, but an example is Skoda cars. They were a Czechoslovakian manufacturer back during the Cold War. They were very, very cheap and utterly rubbish. There used to be jokes told about how a Skoda had a heated rear window to keep your hands warm, or you could double the value of your Skoda simply by filling it up with fuel. Then VAG Group, who owned Volkswagen and Audi, bought the company. Well, today, a Skoda Fabia is a Volkswagen Golf or an Audi A3 with a slightly different body, but the same engine, same running gear, same gearbox, same everything else. Oh, it's got a different badge. A Skoda Octavia is a VW Passat or an Audi A4. Yet there are still people, particularly of my vintage, who could never have a Skoda because they still have such a negative perception of them all these years after they became darn good cars. How those perceptions can be changed is a real problem, but one small way that occurred to me is that all police officers are required by their contracts or their regulations on first contact to refer to any member of the public as sir or madam. I recently listened to the audiobook version of Colonel David Hackworth's autobiography, About Face. Now, Hackworth is a very experienced soldier. He joined the American Army as a teenage private, got a battlefield commission during the Korean War, and was very successful, but became very disillusioned with the conduct of the war in Vietnam. And he gave a couple of press briefings on the verge of retirement. During his time, he once took over a previously poorly led, poorly trained, and very poorly motivated infantry company. Well, he started the process of retraining by introducing an 101st Airborne-inspired saluting system. When he'd served in the 101st, a soldier saluting an officer would call out, "Airborne, sir," and the officer would reply, "All the way." Now, I've got to be honest, we would sometimes observe this when I was in the British Army, and we kind of thought it was funny and laughed at it. And it does seem naff. Hackworth acknowledges that, saying it was deeply unpopular at first with the troops, and they felt embarrassed using whatever phrase he ordered. But nevertheless, it began a process of change and a sense of unity among his men. And I think he says in the book at once, he says, yeah, they were embarrassed, but at least they were all embarrassed together. So it was team embarrassment. I kind of get what he means. Maybe we just start with the small little changes. But going back to the police greeting members of the public, I'm very conscious I'm not familiar with day-to-day life in the US, and I should not judge a society by its depiction in cinema. But I do get the impression that even today it would not be surprising for a white police officer to address an African and adult male as boy, with all its connotations of the days of slavery. Now, I may well be wrong, and such a term of address may well be a sacking offence in this day and age. I'm not sure. But I'm equally sure that there are police officers who'd find it a very difficult prospect to refer to some of the undoubtedly criminal, nasty people with whom they have to deal as sir or madam. But then, when I was in the army, I encountered officers who, on a regular basis, for whom I held no respect at all. I still had to call them sir or ma'am and salute them. I wasn't doing it out of respect for them, but because those were the rules. Struggling to get to my point here, I should also point out I am an instinctive supporter of the police as an institution, and I believe they are a vital part of any civilised society. Some of those calling for their disbandment without replacement may well be members of society who would continue to behave well towards their fellow citizens out of a sense of civic duty. Sadly, there are many who would not, and therefore it's clear to me that some form of law enforcement is necessary. Also, I think those who volunteer to serve in such a capacity should be reasonably compensated in the form of a decent salary, not only as a reward, but also to remove the temptations or reduce the temptations of bribery. And offences against law enforcement officers should be treated as a greater offence than one against a member of the general public. Now, if that seems a bit skewed, imagine an ice hockey player who'd be sin-binned for 5 minutes for fighting with another player, going on to attack a referee. Now, I'm not sure what the penalty would be, but in football, or soccer in Americanese, attacking a referee can lead to lifetime bans. Equally, however, a higher standard of behaviour should be expected from those same law enforcement officers. So if they were to commit an offence, they should expect a correspondingly higher sentence than a member of the general public. And finally, I do want to address the matter of taking a knee. Now, Colin Kaepernick, the San Francisco 49ers quarterback, sat down during the national anthem during a pre-season game in protest against, it wasn't George Floyd, obviously, this was 2016, but there had been a few high-profile cases of police brutality against African Americans. He then kept kneeling when the anthem was played. At the end of that season, and there's a fairly decent argument that this was, the 49ers employed a new coach, and this was more a sporting decision than a political one, but he was made a free agent and he struggled to be employed. President Trump opined that players who failed to stand for the anthem should be fired, but Kaepernick went on to become the inspiration for many, many sports stars to follow suit, and now we see entire teams taking the same protest action. For those who find the failure to stand for the anthem offensive, I would ask them, what form of peaceful protest would you approve? It's non-violent, it's non-vocal. No one's trying to shout down the anthem, I'm always embarrassed when England soccer fans boo an opposing team's national anthem. But in this case, it doesn't hurt anyone. It's anyone's right, enshrined in most countries' laws, to peacefully protest. Now, the burning of flags is more, I'm trying to avoid using the word inflammatory for the obvious pun I'm struggling here, confrontational, maybe. I mean, apart from the criminal damage, if the flag is not the property of the owner, and the obvious risk of someone being hurt by burning fabric, it is a far more visceral display of anger at one's own nation. Or, of course, another nation. Now, in researching for this episode, I did watch a fascinating video which is available on YouTube. This was the 1965 Cambridge University hosted debate between libertarian right-wing intellectual William F. Buckley and African-American writer James Baldwin. Now, the Cambridge University Debating Society, it is a little bit, intellectual sport. You get a score. There's a vote at the end for who the debating society collectively feel won the debate. James Baldwin, the African-American author, he got over 500 votes. William Buckley got just over 100, so comfortably won. But he said something during this debate, James Baldwin, which really hit home to me. And this is a quote. "It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality involved any place for you." So, how how can anyone protest against protest, especially peaceful ones, from people who feel disenfranchised, stateless and ignored? Some of the loudest protests against the kneeling during anthems came from groups who would subsequently counter-protest whilst exercising their right to bear arms. And the sight of camouflage-wearing masked armed men with assault rifles was something that, just in case our American listeners are not aware, brought a mixture of shock and mockery from the rest of the watching world. And a number of quite often hilarious Walter Mitty references seen on Twitter and Facebook were legion. And then the thought would invariably seep into my mind of what would the police reaction have been had those armed groups been African American. Now, I really do have to wrap up here or I'll still be talking when the next show is due, which cleverly segues me into when the next episode will be out. Still a little bit uncertain, but it will be announced via the episodes page of the website, on the Facebook page, facebook.com/History by Hollywood, or on Twitter, where we're at History by Hwood. And it will probably be midway, depending on the availability of our planned guest host for that episode, Ray Harris, of the History of World War II podcast fame, amongst others. And after that, it should be Battle of the Sexes with Andrew. So, until next time, folks, be safe, be well, be happy, and once again, we're going to be played out by the wonderful instrument that is the theremin. Thank you, and good night.